produced two of the largest studies on Americans and their environmental attitudes. They're available on my website, which is thesocialcapitalproject.org. There's two that I mentioned. The first is a study of the U.S. public based on environmental values. So what are the values that underlie opinion and motivate behavior? And in understanding that, how do we uncover the barriers to why people don't act? And then the other major study that we've done is on how to frame the global warming and energy conversation. Most recently, we produced a guidebook for practitioners that combines this research and adds in a behavior change component. And again, this is all available on our website, so feel free to check it out. And obviously, there are a lot of great examples of successful community outreach and communications right in this room, so I'm hoping that we can bring those stories back in. So in what I want to present today, to give you a sense of what the polling says about Americans and their views on energy efficiency, some particular opportunities in Washington State that you have with constituents here, and then some local success stories, which I'm hoping Eric in particular can help fill in. So there's a lot of really good news in terms of public opinion on energy efficiency in particular. It tends to be a little bit easier topic in the energy space than just going at global warming directly, for example. And that's for a couple of reasons. It really is an issue where people feel a sense of responsibility and they actually have some options to act because there are often many low-hanging fruit opportunities. And then there's a perception of self-interest. So having the feeling of responsibility and wanting to be responsible stewards, wanting to think about our kids, our grandkids, tied in with the fact that this might actually benefit you because you could save money, tends to be a pretty winning combination. In terms of jobs, economics around this issue, there's also a lot of good news, which I think is really important to keep in mind, that even during the recession, most Americans believe that there is no longer a trade-off between jobs and the environment, that clean energy can actually lead to economic opportunities and to job growth. And that's held pretty consistent. It has dropped a little bit in 2010 compared with levels that were very high in 2008. But nonetheless, if you pull the trend line back to 1997, that's actually an area where we've seen a lot of growth and a lot of acceleration. Now, it's not to say that the jobs versus environment, or if you go ahead and try and promote clean energy, you're going to impact the economy. Those arguments are still out there, and we need to address them. But now people really, it's becoming common knowledge that that the trade-off isn't always there in such a difficult way. Americans tend to like incentives better than, so we prefer the carrot over the stick. Often they do need to fit together, but I think in the energy efficiency area, there are often a lot of incentives, a lot of subsidies, a lot of ways that you can point to, in particular, the role of government helping to push innovation and helping to push some good opportunities. When it comes to, it's not just cost in terms of dollars and cents, though. There are other things that people want from addressing these issues, and part of it is to be seen as a leader again around the world in terms of innovation and economic power. So there's the dollars and cents part. I potentially could save money. But there's this larger set of values around the economics that have to do with innovation and global leadership. Another thing that's very positive when it comes to energy efficiency and the public, while it may be difficult to get people to initially overcome some of the cost barriers or other structural barriers, like I don't have the know-how to make my home more efficient, once people actually make the change and make the structural change, very rarely do they undo it. So if you go ahead with water conservation, for example, and put in low flow shower heads, you're not going to bother taking them apart. So the good thing is once some of those structural changes are made, they stick. And the other thing that I think is very positive is once people start on this pathway, they tend to want to do more and more and more. So we may joke about the light bulb, but the light bulb is often a great way to then get inspired about more and more things that can be done. Now, it's not all great news. There are challenges around energy efficiency in particular in the public's mind. And I think one is that the default is just that people tend to think more about energy production. So the idea of a windmill or a solar panel, it's very exciting, it's visual, it's problem solving, it's advancement. Sometimes when you're dealing with energy efficiency, it's a bit invisible. It's not necessarily an exciting issue. The comment was made, I think, by Sean about the notion that energy efficiency is putting on your sweater and turning down your thermostat. So while it's seen as very practical and very smart, it's not necessarily urgent or sexy. So there are things we can do to actually increase the excitement around the issue. Another big challenge is the fact that most Americans have this sense that technology evolves at its own pace and on its own. So sometimes because of that belief, you don't necessarily understand the drivers that allow these technologies to move along. So sometimes that means still making the case for why you might need a policy, why you might need incentives, new investments, because a lot of people think, well, this is just America and that's just how things progress, and don't necessarily understand the mechanisms behind that. People, for the most part, all across the country are very cost sensitive. This can be a pro and a con in the energy efficiency area. A pro is that, as I said earlier, there is the idea that you could save money, that it's in your self-interest. So that's working for us. The downside on an individual level, though, is that electricity costs are rarely high enough on their own to motivate a lot of action. And so that's why the earlier point about really fusing the sense of responsibility with the potential to be acting in your self-interest is very, very critical. Having the economics hanging out by themselves is not always enough to motivate the individual. The other thing that can be quite challenging is for many people, even if they have an interest in energy efficiency and they want to move in that direction, the structural barriers can be significant, from cost, access to information, a sense of whether or not you have the ability to make the changes in your home. Perhaps you're a renter and you're not going to invest in improving the efficiency of appliances in your apartment. It just doesn't pay off. So we do need to think both about the structural side of energy efficiency, but also the behavioral side and how they fit together. And in part because when it comes to actually adopting new technologies, so much of whether or not that actually leads to energy savings is behavioral, and it's about how people think about it versus the technology itself. The thing I find very, very compelling about energy efficiency is that it actually resonates across a broad spectrum of the American public and across a broad range of ideologies and worldviews. This is a graph from Yale and George Mason universities. I don't know if you've seen the 6 Americas. It's a really great study that segments the public into 6 core groups based on what they think about climate issues. From the alarmed, which is the people who care most, who are really looking for active ways to engage, to the dismissive, which is where you would find climate deniers. But if you take a look at this chart, they actually asked around 5 specific energy efficient steps you could take in your home. And if you look at those bubbles, which represent those 6 different parts of America, the deniers are almost as likely, and in some cases more likely, to engage in energy efficiency practices in the home. They're doing it for completely different reasons, however, and I think it's very important to understand your constituencies who you're trying to move on the issue and understand what their motivator is. So for example, for the alarmed, a lot of it is about global warming. That is the concern. Thinking about my kids, the future, where are things going? When you get to the dismissive, it's much more about independence, self-sufficiency, reducing our dependence on foreign oil, national security concerns. You tend to politically, in the dismissive group, get a lot of people who have more libertarian views where, you know, they just want to be able to take care of themselves and take care of business themselves. So I find this incredibly interesting and a great opportunity when it comes to efficiency. You just have to be very careful what you lead with and whether or not the environment or climate is top of mind or some of these other drivers. And obviously the cost savings is a big factor, as I mentioned earlier. It actually is true also for conservation, so not just the weatherizing, not just the putting in the insulation, but the turning off the lights, the using less energy. You see the dismissive and the doubtful drop a bit, so it's not as compelling as some of the other steps in efficiency, which are really tied to self-reliance. But nonetheless, there's a lot to work with here too. So an incredible opportunity to actually build support across a broad range of constituents and voters. Now, let's take a look at Washington State in particular, because obviously the national trends are one thing, but knowing how this plays out in the region is very important. One note overall, before I explain to you what this is that Washington State is actually one of the states that has a mega majority of concern around climate issues. So again, not with all of the constituencies that you would be trying to motivate, but there's actually a lot of people in the state who feel it is a top priority that we should be acting on. And that's only a handful of states in the country are like that, less than 5. So there's a great opportunity in Washington State to lead and to really move people on the issue. This is a chart that outlines the segmentation study I mentioned that we did based on people's social values and organizing people into 10 distinct groups based on their worldviews. So this is not around demographics. These groups are organized based on how people think of the environment and their role in it. And it ranges from the top of the chart where you have the highest levels of the social value called ecological concern. The segmentation study tracks about 130 different social values, so that is psychographic data that we're working with that allows us to make these summaries. So the greenest Americans are the 9% of the public who prioritize ecological concern above the other 130 values. It is a major driver for them. And in Washington State, you actually have a much higher percentage of the greenest Americans than the national average. Not quite double, but significantly higher than the national average. It goes down the spectrum, though, to the ungreens. And it's almost not the right term for them, because a lot of the people in this bottom segment actually have environmental values. Often they're hunters, fishers, like the outdoors, camping, what have you. But they hate environmentalists. So that's where the environmental ideology is really getting in the way, where if you wrap that sort of green banner around your issue, you not only lose these people, you actually motivate them to work against you. So there's a whole range. So the not so great news about Washington State is that you have a slightly higher representation of the ungreens than the national average. So if sometimes you sort of feel like, well, it seems like most people in our area care about these issues, why is the debate still so polarized? Because you actually have different worldviews playing out. Now, not so much, actually, let me just show you a few things. So with the greenest Americans, from the survey, we are able to identify some demographic characteristics for targeting purposes, but the values are what really hold this group together. And sometimes the values that motivate one group are oppositional to other groups. So for example, national pride for more traditionally minded Americans, that is a top value. For the greenest Americans, that doesn't work. So you wouldn't want to make the case to the greenest Americans that we want America to dominate the global economy again, and a great way to do it is to invest in energy efficiency. That might work for other segments of the public, however. Let me skip over, though, to your map of your area. And what we were able to do in Washington State and Oregon was to take our 10 value segments and map them down to the county level. And basically, you see the colors for the 10 groups along the side. And this allows you to really start to understand the worldviews at play in your region on these issues. So as you can see, look at that green. That green is great. Now just one note though, some of why you see the big patches of green is they might be in areas with low population levels. So that it skews to some extent the dominance of the segment within that particular area. And this is actually mapped down to the census block level. But nonetheless, as you can see, there's a lot to work with in terms of those eco-minded people. The other thing that really shows up, though, is you have a lot of the people who we call the murky middles. And they're sort of, you know, like the average American. They're primarily concerned with getting ahead financially, very concerned about their status still in society. And as it ends up, they actually don't hold any social values at a very high level. So other groups are sort of adamant about one thing or another, and the reason why we call them the murky middles is that they are sort of like swing voters. They can go either way. But the good news is that once something becomes a mainstream trend, they go along for the ride. So I actually think for your region, it's kind of an interesting map with some opportunities, because the green people can lead and the murky middles will eventually follow, particularly if the self-interest piece is coming in for them. So there's a lot more to talk about there, but without sort of going in any deeper, I just wanted to give you the snapshot. I'm happy to talk later about ways that you might use this kind of information in developing outreach programs in your communities. I think the real benefit, though, to it is that it does allow you to figure out, well, if an environmental frame doesn't work, what could work? What does motivate these different constituencies? So that's really the benefit of this approach.
Karen,
Yeah.
how do you get this data? Is this based on voting patterns, or?
This basically was a modeling effort. So we took the national segmentation study and we used the Catalyst voter file, which is the largest file of voter data in the country. And we used their neighborhood clustering system and mapped our segments onto those. So it's modeling, it's not precise. But I have found in working with these maps, in particular in campaign work around Seattle, that they're quite accurate. And it's funny because when I was working I used to work at Earth Justice as the VP of Communications for many years there. And when I showed the staff in the Seattle office the values maps, they were like, well, yeah, because that's where I live, in the green area. You know, and all the staff was like, yeah, that's where we all live, in the areas that show really green. So, you know, you have to be careful because it's modeling, but it's at least it's accurate enough that you get that sense that you can then, you know, look at other demographic data, other consumer data to verify. But it does give you a sense of the overall trends. And these detailed maps are not currently on our website, but I'm happy to make them available to anyone and just send you email files for your region. So just drop me an email after the session and I'm more than happy to share that. We have about 100 maps, so all over Washington State and Oregon. And you can, when you use them online, you can zoom in and out, so you can get really much more detail around your particular community.
Can we do that on our website or link to it on our website?
Sure. Yeah, we can figure that out. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. There is, in the summary of the ecological roadmap, there are some sample maps there, so that might be the way to go because it puts it in a bit of context. Otherwise, you would look at this and sort of say, what are you trying to tell me is going on here? So, and Eric spoke earlier this morning about some of the work that has been going on at the community level. And I think it's really exciting to see these efforts that are really bubbling from the grassroots up. And I think it's particularly critical in order to drive the kind of change that's necessary to restructure our energy and economic systems. That we can't sit around and wait for federal policy. And even if we could, I'm not necessarily convinced that's going to be enough. I spent 10 years at Earth Justice working on the enforcement of environmental laws. And just because you have a great law doesn't mean that it gets enforced in the way that it should, and you really rely on strong public opinion and engagement to make even the policies function in the right way. But I'm also really interested in what Eric and others are doing because of some of what I've been learning about social change theory and what really pushes communities, societies to take transformational steps. And the work of Marshall Gans from Harvard in particular is very, very interesting. He studies social change all over the world throughout time. And in order to really see massive, massive change, he's convinced that you need to find the thing that the largest number of people within your community or your culture can do without harm to themselves that has the biggest economic, political, and social impact. So you can think about that in a number of ways. For example, during the civil rights movement, the bus token served that function. Earlier times, the Tea Party, dumping tea into the Boston Harbor, that was very intentional because tea was an example of British rule. And by rejecting tea, it sent ripples effects through the economic system as well as the culture and the politics. So I think we need to think a little bit about what is the role of the public in our efforts to promote energy efficiency, and can we actually ask people to play a significant role in the kind of change that we see necessary. And I think the appetite is really there. You know, when you think about all of these groups, and they're popping up all across the country now, where it's people in their volunteer hours, after their day job, going to meetings, connecting with each other to figure out what can be done. And I think part of why these models tend to work is that a big thing that prohibits people from actually engaging in these issues is, well, a couple of things. A sense of social isolation, that I may care, but I don't know that anyone else does. And also a sense, and Derek said it earlier, being part of something larger than yourself. Everyone is searching for meaning in their lives. And from the work I did on social values, you can see that where environmental concern is lacking, it goes hand in hand with values that really are about social isolation. So I don't feel like I'm part of a community that I care about or that anyone cares about me. And I don't feel like my life has any meaning. And that's particularly troublesome with young Americans who tend to, not everyone, and I imagine no one in this room, but there is a large percentage of younger Americans who really don't have a sense that their life has meaning or that they have personal goals for themselves. So again, connecting people to one another, building community is a huge, huge driver and promoting a whole number of sustainable practices, including energy efficiency. One of the best examples I've seen of this is a recent project called the 2 Mile Diet, where within a 2-mile area in Vancouver, British Columbia, people started getting together to help each other produce food in their backyards. And it led then to going in and raising money for canning processing equipment. And so this group of people over a few years are raising their own chickens, growing their own food, processing it together. But if you ask them what is one of the biggest benefits of being engaged in this, besides the sense of empowerment and that they actually can do something about the issues that they care about, is that for neighbors who have lived in this area for decades, it's the first time they've been into each other's homes. And I do think that we're all longing for that kind of connection. And so the more we can think about that community aspect being integrated into our efforts to promote sane energy practices, the better. The low carbon diet, which the Beat the Heat folks adopted, this is a model that is being used all over the country and now all over the world. I think it's pretty interesting because it does tend to lead to very, very measurable results. So most of the communities that have done low carbon diet processes have saved at least 25% energy and water resources. And as Eric told me in an earlier phone call, it doesn't necessarily stop there. People sort of get going on this path and they want to do more and more and more. So they may start with the low flow shower heads, but at the end they may be figuring out how to pay for and install solar panels on the roof of their house. I'm particularly interested in how that then scales up to support for policy and government action, because they're connected. I think we need to give people things that they can do in their life, give them daily practices that ultimately allow them to see the value of government action and policy on these issues. So let me move now into some recommendations when you are leaving here today and you're putting together your energy efficiency program plans and you're trying to figure out how to sell it to whatever constituency base you have. Obviously, audience matters, so really my first recommendation is make sure you really understand the worldview of those you need to engage. And if they happen to be a segment of the public who don't prioritize environmental issues or global warming, don't start there. Start with where they're at. Start with national security. Start with frugality, responsible savings, the values that resonate. And I said this earlier, but again, just emphasizing the costs that's very important, but it tends to not be enough. The more we fuse that with the sense of possibility, stewardship, responsibility, the better. There are some core values that most Americans hold that can be brought into your conversations about energy efficiency. The can-do spirit, that we're people who just roll up our sleeves and jump in and make things happen. American leadership, I mentioned this earlier, but that sense of wanting to have America be a leader in the world, both in terms of being a democratic society, but also an innovator and an economic power. Smartness is just a smart thing to do. I mean, energy efficiency is just a smart thing to do. Most people would have a hard time arguing with that fact. And it's also very, very practical. So those are some values that most people do hold. Now, not everyone, but the majority of the public. One of the things that I think we really need to think about is how do we actually promote systemic thinking? When you spend a lot of time thinking and working on these issues, you very easily make the mental leaps between energy, the economy, and the environment. But as it ends up, most Americans don't have a big capacity to think systemically about anything. It's much more simple causation. So if I step out into the street and a bus is coming, I'm going to get hit by the bus. Versus the frustration that a lot of people have around environmental problems. So you tell me that there's something wrong with air quality, but then I go to try and address that and then I've got a water quality problem. It's just really hard for people to actually wrap their heads around those connections. And often when we're working on these issues every day, we forget that people don't make those leaps as easily. So we really actually have to help those connections come together, almost like doing a connect the dot puzzle, that you don't see the picture until all the lines are filled in and then you say, aha, now I can see it. I think we actually very intentionally need to be making the connections between energy, economy, and environment for people. Energy efficiency, because it's not exciting or sexy or because it's not easily seen, I think we need to provide very specific, concrete examples of how it works and why it's a good thing. So pointing to a building in your area that's benefited from performance contracting or been part of the energy challenge, having those living models, those living case studies is very, very important. The other thing that you find is that most Americans, well, they do sort of think that technologies evolve on their own. There's another side to that, which is they don't necessarily think that technologies for energy efficiency or for renewable energy are ready to be taken to scale that can actually replace existing energy sources or meet our growing energy needs. And so again, I think we need very concrete, tangible examples of the technologies and practices that are available and being used right now. And so whenever I see a communications piece that talks about a clean energy future, I cringe, because we don't want to push it off into the future. We want to bring it back to this day, right now. This is in action. This is something that we can move on immediately. Let me just talk a little bit about some very, very basics from behavior change theory that are relevant to talking about energy efficiency or energy sustainability even more generally. You know, there's a huge amount of literature and research on what makes people, organizations, and societies change. You can actually boil it down into 3 very specific things that are needed to change. The first is that there needs to be a sense of tension. There needs to be a sense that there is a disconnect between the values that you hold and the current state of affairs. And it needs to be significant enough that it's uncomfortable and that you actually want to act. So a lot of times when we're dealing with energy issues, the tendency is, well, let's just focus on the positive side. And I think you actually need both. You need a little bit about the challenge as well as the possibility to come together and ideally be in scale with one another. Efficacy. So it's one thing to feel tension, but to then have a sense that you can actually resolve that tension is extremely critical. And I think a lot of the discussions that we've had on energy and global warming in particular has been focused on tension, the crisis, the problem, versus the efficacy. What's the roadmap for moving forward? What's the vision? What is a big idea and some very practical steps for getting there? So efficacy really plays out both on an individual level as well as on a societal level. So one of the challenges we have right now is that well, a lot of Americans think it's possible to address global warming. They actually don't think that anyone's going to get around to it. That we're just not going to motivate ourselves to take that step. So making sure it's really clear, not just what can be done, but what is the role for government, business, and individuals, and assigning those roles in the story that we're telling. And then benefits. In order to change, not only do you need to feel like you should change, that there are ways to change, but that it's actually going to be in your self-interest to change. And typically, people need to see 2 times the benefits to the cost of taking that action. So I think that's something just very concrete to keep in mind when you're talking about energy efficiency. Do you have at least 2 benefits to the costs? And if you have more than 2, all the better. A lot of times we want people to jump right into supporting government action, supporting policies, but often we do need to start with those earlier low-hanging fruit activities, but not necessarily stop there. So it can be very frustrating if you lay out, like actually in Inconvenient Truth, all of the arguments about what's happening with global warming and why it's such a big issue, and then at the end tell people, just change a light bulb. You know, that's not very satisfying. But if you think about it as an engagement continuum, meeting people where they are and over time moving them to higher and higher levels of engagement, that tends to really work. And I think those who spend time in corporate communications and marketing instinctively get this. It's how you basically build your customer base. Another thing that really works in engaging the public in efforts to become more efficient or to choose different energy sources is to actually reward the leaders publicly. So I think Derek had some great examples of people do. They want to have the lawn sign. They want to have the, yay, I did it. I did the right thing. And it's not just enough to sort of tell someone at the end of the day, just to them, well, great job. They actually want to be recognized in their community for that leadership. Because people do tend to think more naturally about energy production, it's often a good idea to tie energy efficiency to clean energy production and to let people know how the 2 fit together. That we want to be more efficient with our energy use, but we actually also want to change the energy that we're using. So bringing those 2 stories together. And then, you know, one of the things that, well, energy efficiency has a lot of benefits because it is practical, because there are a lot of easy entry points. We also don't want to oversell the simplicity of it, because as you all were talking this morning, there are a lot of barriers. It isn't necessarily a slam dunk. It can take time, it can take money and expertise. So while we want to be clear on what the benefits are, we don't want to make it seem like, okay, those are the benefits now, that's just easy and it's going to happen overnight. I think some of the dialogue around green jobs is an example where we didn't really fill that out to actually say, well, what kind of jobs are we talking about, and how do you actually create those jobs, and who would be eligible for those jobs? So really making sure that while we're touting the benefits, that we don't make it all seem so easy that it lets people off the hook to not have to engage and be your partner in the change. My last point before we move over to discussion is just to say that, you know, using the right words that poll effectively with the public is very important. It's good knowledge to have. It's a lot of the information that's in the guidebooks. But ultimately, if we want to move the public, we need to tell stories about these issues. We need to take the facts and the right words and embed them in our own narratives about why this is an issue that we all care about and why we think others should care about it too. From a really, really early age, the way that we process information, relate to each other, and understand our role in the world is through stories. And oftentimes we're frustrated by the fact that people who maybe aren't as supportive of changes in how we produce and use energy don't necessarily make fact-based arguments. They don't necessarily have the economics or the science on their side, and yet people listen to them. And people listen to them because the truth of a story is not in the accuracy of the facts. It's in the emotion and the feeling that it leaves you with. It's whether or not it actually moved you at the end of the day. And so all of you as leaders in the region, the more you bring your own story into why you are personally motivated to work on these issues, the best. And that may seem a bit odd because we're used to being experts, we're used to being looked at for our knowledge, our skills. But if we actually want people to get to the point of motivation to act, we need to also share with them a bit about our emotional side and what inspires us, what concerns us, what we feel the big opportunities are. So there's a whole lot of other things we could say about storytelling, but I just wanted to leave you with that last point because I think it's so critical that we not just sort of put out great fact-based arguments and press releases, but we think about how our own experiences, our own stories, and our values are part of what motivates the public to care about these issues. So with that, I'll stop. I know we wanted to leave time for discussion and also to be able to have time at the end to come back to the idea board. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions on what I presented?
How about a round of applause?
Yes, and you know, it actually shows up in the data too. So for example, the ungreens tend to have pretty high socioeconomic status. So they're not necessarily uneducated, non-influential, marginalized people. They just have a different worldview. On the other hand, you know, I've spent a lot of time looking, okay, well, are there demographic factors that would predispose someone or drive someone to concern more than someone else? And, you know, who we are and our experience in the world does influence how we think. So, but it's really hard to make a strong correlation to any demographic factor when it comes to ecological concern, except for education. Because education is the one tool that we have to actually increase our ability to think systemically and to see ourselves in this picture. You know, the other thing though, so I absolutely agree, it's not about people being stupid, or it's just that they have a different way of seeing the world and their role in it. On the other hand, you know, there's a lot of discussion about, well, should we just go with what people like then, right? So everyone is concerned about national security. Should everything just be about national security? And at some point, we do need people to understand that global warming is a real issue that we need to address in a whole number of ways. So, you know, I think you start with where people are at, but you have to figure out how to bring in some of the other thinking over time that would fill out that sort of picture of the world and the role.
Round it out.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I think there have been some really interesting examples, though, from the national security community around how to deal with the challenge of uncertainty, which is often what we're plagued with when we're trying to take global warming head on. It's often what the media is emphasizing, the lack of scientific certainty. And there's a really interesting project where basically all of these military leaders got together and who care about energy and climate. And one quote was from a retired general who said, "No one operates with 100% certainty. And in a military context, that would be suicide. You can't wait for 100% certainty to act. You need to assess the trend lines, and even if there's some question out there as to whether a threat is as significant as you think, if there are enough trend lines to indicate it is a serious threat, then you better prepare for that threat." So there is a lot to work with around people's existing worldviews and how to begin to at least plant the seeds to get the motivation going. But I think there are other spokespersons who could be perhaps more influential. There's been quite a bit of research showing that when it comes to matters of climate, that weathercasters are very influential, and the folks from Yale and George Mason did a study and actually found really dismal results of what weathercasters think about in terms of global warming. So they actually have a project now trying to influence and train weathercasters around global warming issues, because the weatherman is the weatherman, and that's who we sort of go to have grounding in these conversations. Religious leaders, you know, if someone has a much more traditional conservative religious worldview, hearing from their pastor, their minister, that will motivate them much more than a scientist. You know, unfortunately, very few cases is the environmental voice the most compelling voice. And I mean, again, it's sort of something to say, well, then forget the environmental voices. Well, the environmental voices have a role to play, and they are trusted when it comes to accountability. You know, corporate accountability, government accountability. But general sort of trusted source of knowledge, no.
What about the government? I mean, with all the municipality representation in this room.
Well, you know, the good thing is that for a really consistent period of time now, there has been strong support for government action on energy issues. And people really see that government has a role to play in setting standards, holding business accountable, and leveling the playing field. I think it also ties back to leadership and the sense that we want to have leaders at all levels of our society, from local community up to global leadership. So, you know, that's another place where there's a lot to work with. I think one of the challenges is because of what's happened with federal legislative process, there's a lot of frustration right now, and the sense of, I'm going to steal Eric's term, government impotence. And, you know, in a way, on a local level, it gives you some room to actually illustrate that there is leadership, that problems can be solved. But I think part of it involves making sure that there's representation and examples of success that clearly illustrate the role of government. And I've been thinking about, why is it that when it comes to government expenditures, the main way we see that advertised and promoted and branded is with highway projects? So you're driving along, you see, okay, we just invested X amount of money to fix this road. Well, what are some other very visible ways that we could make the role of government and government investments that are leading to improvements in our lives more obvious? Because I think oftentimes by the time you get into the policy landscape, it's sort of invisible for people. Most people don't think about policy. They just sort of want things to be a certain way. Now, I think the challenge that we have right now is mixed bag opinions around government investments and investing in public infrastructure. So there's sort of this sense like, okay, the stairs up to my apartment building are broken. Someone better come along and fix it. Don't charge me for it, and don't bother going past the first floor where I live, because I don't care about the people on, you know, the top 8 floors. So there are a lot of issues that we have to deal with there, but again, I think it's these local visible examples of success. So it's not enough to just do the program. How are you promoting it? And how are you putting those signs in the windows of the partners so you're constantly reminding people of the benefits you're actually delivering? But people do understand and accept that government needs to play a leadership role.
How about another round of applause for Cara?